my primary concern was not to get myself elected to Holyrood, if I can put it that way.
That sounds like you're running, Ian.
No, please don't, and I don't want to see anybody taking that from it.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lucy Dunn, and today I'm joined by Michael Simmons and former SNP MP Ian Blackford. Nicola Sturgeon's memoir, Frankly, has hit bookshelves this week, and it's causing quite a stir. Ian, you have been known to be a close ally of Nicola Sturgeon. Is there anything that you've seen so far from the interviews, the book, the clips online that has surprised you at all?
No, I don't think so. And I think, what I would say, Lucy, I'm actually quite concerned about where we are in our politics and the discourse. And there's a lot of rancor, isn't there, in the debate, not just around this, but everything. And I think that's a great pity because, yes, of course, there's important issues to discuss and we shouldn't demur from that. But I think also it's an opportunity to reflect on what Nicola achieved as First Minister, but if I may say so, not just as First Minister, in her long political career, because this has defined her life. I've known her since she was a teenager. She has been an ever-present in the Scottish Parliament since 1999. And of course, in government since 2007 as well. So there's a lot that's happened over that period. I think all of us should try and be honest and reflective in the right way in politics as well. There's an awful lot that she did right. I think there's an awful lot that the SNP did that has delivered for the people of Scotland over that period as well. Let's be honest, there's been some challenges as well. And it's a party, a government, that needs to find its focus in public life today. We face so many challenges. You think about the global picture, think about where the UK is with the economy. One of the things I would agree with the narrative of the Spectator is the fact that I would suggest, very close to a financial crisis in the UK. So how do we respond to all of that? What's Scotland's position in all of that? How should the Parliament and the government be responding? There's lots of really big, meaty issues. But of course, we're dealing with a lot of the personality side of what's happened over the last few years, if I may put it that way.
And Michael, I'll bring you in for balance here. Maybe, slightly different stance than Ian might take on this. You've written a lot about Nicola Sturgeon over your time at The Spectator, and more recently you wrote an article about her record as First Minister. Ian's just talked there about, pros and cons. All parties have good and bad moments. Do you think that the coverage that we've seen so far about Nicola Sturgeon's memoir has fairly reflected her stance as First Minister?
Well, I think that the book coming out now is the latest sort of example of the PR successes of Nicola Sturgeon, perhaps over some of the more substantive issues of her legacy. This is something she did incredibly well as First Minister. If something went wrong, whether it was something on ferries, if there was a mistake made during COVID, she was very good at sort of turning it into an apology, and then we would all just move on from the issue. I also think the way she's viewed in England is probably sort of with a less critical or sort of divisive eye. And I wanted to write the piece to just say, let's not let that happen this time. If you look at the book itself, so one of the things I mentioned in the blog that I think is really shameful that went on not just during the time that Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister of Scotland, but it got significantly worse during her time, is obviously the drugs deaths, which under Nicola Sturgeon climbed up to being the highest in Europe when you looked sort of adjusted it per capita. Now, Alex Massey, I think, mentioned this in his Times column. She has like 4 paragraphs in the book about her appearance on Jon Stewart's Daily Show in America and free mentions of drugs deaths. And I think, unfortunately, I would say, fortunately for Nicola the politician, she had unrivaled electoral success. She won 8 consecutive elections, and no one can take that away from her. But I think that her legacy really is of public service failures, worsening life expectancy, the terrible drug deaths and the state of the economy, which, as Ian says, is a UK-wide issue. But we had the JERS figures today, which don't paint the Scottish fiscal position in a brilliant light either. And I'm just keen that the actual substance of her legacy doesn't get taken away by, tidbits in the book.
Well, that's an interesting point, Ian. As Michael mentioned just there, he talked a bit about record. That doesn't really seem to come up in Nicola's memoir and doesn't really come up so much in terms of interviews so far. And maybe that is partly due to because she's speaking to sort of UK-based journalists as opposed to journalists in Scotland who'll be more into the nitty-gritty of the detail there. But on the point about her legacy, I mean, what do you think Nicola Sturgeon's legacy is, and has it been affected at all by, for example, events over the last 2 years?
Well, I think, of course, the events of the last couple of years have been difficult. And if you think about everything that's gone on for Nicola, you think about the situation with Alex Salmond, you think about COVID, you think, of course, the police inquiry and what happened with Peter. You're talking about 3 major events that have happened very, very, very quickly. She is, I'm, I suppose, lucky in some respects because I know her very well and I know the type of person that she is. She is a very thoughtful person and she thinks very much about, frankly, where government could have made mistakes. And you can go all through a lot of the things that Michael said. Of course, they're the reality. And I don't deny for 1 minute about the embarrassment, and it is the embarrassment over the ferries. However, what I would say is there ought to be some balance into that as well, because, you can look at that having gone wrong, but we can think about other fairly large capital projects in Scotland, the Queensferry crossing, the Aberdeen peripheral bypass and so on. Okay, these happened over a long period of time, but delivered on budget and delivered material improvements to the lives of people using these facilities. But on the other hand, where is the analysis of what's gone wrong in the UK in terms of HS2, in terms of the Crossrail project, in terms of what happened with the aircraft carriers and so on? So there's often, and I think particularly in Scotland, we focus very much on the ferries, and I'm not denying the validity of that, but it's not as if the SNP is the only government that's faced problems with infrastructure projects. The same would be true elsewhere.
But we talk about HS2 all the time down here, Ian.
Yes, but I think there is a difference in terms of the primacy that's given to that, and in particular given the focus which is given to First Minister's questions and the type of issues that are discussed. And I don't mean to be defensive over that, but I also think there's a lot of good things that the Scottish Government has done. And I think that desire to try and do things that could make a difference to the outcomes of people's lives, like, for example, the child payment, just to give one example. Of course, it isn't a report card where everything has gone well. I absolutely acknowledge that. But I think there's an awful lot of good that we have done over the period. And of course, there are important points of differences when it comes to not having tuition fees, the access that we've tried to provide for people to get to university and so on and so forth. So there's lots of things that you could debate around all of that. She is a very good communicator. I absolutely accept that. I don't think, I think she was actually without peer, certainly in Scotland over that period, and arguably with maybe the odd exception in Westminster, that would be very much the case as well. And I suppose, we're going to reflect on her book just now, but in the end, history will judge her on that long period, not only when she was in government, but of course where she was deputy to Alex Salmond, and also the fact that she was such an instrumental figure in the referendum campaign. Much has been said over the last few days as to the parts that both Nicola played and Alec played, and it's very clear in the early parts of it that she was the one doing the heavy lifting. And I remember very well the early debates that were on STV, where she was having to represent the Yes case. My goodness, did she present a very powerful figure. I remember the debate with Michael Moore, for example, at that time. So I think there's a lot to be thankful for and grateful for what she achieved. I think also the reputation of Nicola as the person, and often people refer to the fact that as a young adult she was relatively shy. There is an innate shyness which is there in her, and I think it's fair to say that there were a small group of people around her. She had a different personality from many others, a very different personality to me, for example. But I have to say, in the role that I had, a much more junior role as being the SNP Westminster leader, what a sense of support and comfort she was. And she's actually much more of a team player than perhaps people would give her credit for. It was never the case that she would say to me, "You've got to do this and you've got to do that." It was a partnership, and it was. I was lucky to work with someone that I respected so much as the leader of the party, as the First Minister of Scotland, but on many levels that she saw the two of us having a relationship of equals.
It's interesting you make that point about her being a team player. I think there's been a lot said recently about, well, not only just from her opponents, but certainly by Nicola herself. And in the memoir, she talks about how she was always quite up for cross-party working, and this led to this Butte House agreement with the Scottish Greens, and also previous cases of working with different parties, for example, on budgets. I mean, I'm curious, Michael, I suppose, Sturgeon having talked about toxicity in politics too. I mean, one of the big things that we all remember from very recent history is the gender reform bill, and I think there's a lot of people who would say, actually, even if they're on the side of the SNP, that there was a lot of division about that, there was a lot of toxicity, and I think a lot of them would point the blame at Sturgeon. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I suspect Ian might disagree with me on this, but that is something I do take serious issue with Nicola Sturgeon. She's always sort of tried to claim to be doing they go low, we go high kind of way of politics. That's not how I've ever personally experienced it. I think the GRA, the debate and everything was toxic on all sides because it's such an emotive issue. But as much as Nicola's spent recent days, say, criticising how involved J.K. Rowling got in the debate, it's certainly true that the Scottish Government were sort of really demonising anyone who had an opinion that disagreed with them because it didn't fit into this image of a progressive Scotland. But you can take that back further, actually, and go back to the referendum. We're often told that, 2014 was like a great civic, joyous event in Scotland. My experience of it was it actually, it at points got quite nasty. We don't have to relitigate any of that. But I think the idea that Nicola Sturgeon is somehow the victim of a toxic political environment and not one of the people that was pouring, fuel on the flames is completely for the birds.
I mean, Ian, just on the subject of independence, I think what I found quite interesting about this memoir is, first of all, Nicola had gone to a UK publisher, not a Scottish publisher. And second of all, she'd spoken to UK interviewers, as Michael has pointed out, and not Scottish interviewers who, as we said before, understand the fine detail of what went on in the past, couple of decades ultimately in Scotland. And third of all, I think what's really interesting is in the book itself, there isn't all that much sort of sorrow expressed about there not being a second independence referendum. And I suppose my final point would be, actually, she said towards the end that she wants to move to London. So as much as this book is about her softening her hard exterior that we all know, is she maybe softening her approach to independence or her stance on independence altogether?
No, she's not at all. Absolutely not. Actually, I've spoken with her today, and we've actually, amongst all sorts of other things, we've discussed where we are in independence, and I can tell you that the fire burns deep inside her in wanting Scotland to be an independent country. But, if I can make 2 points, Lucy, I mean, just on the GRA, let's just be honest, it wasn't our finest hour, and that toxicity that you've both referred to, nobody can take any joy out of that. And we've got to reflect on that and think about how can we get a more balanced political discourse for the benefit of everybody. And let me put it in this context for you. If I think about the journey that Scotland had been on since the establishment of the Parliament and becoming a much more liberal society, there was, at a certain point, there was much more of a broad political consensus that the last bit that had to be tackled was trans rights. And I suppose, for someone that really wasn't engaged in that debate, how do you do that? But how do you do that by balancing women's rights within all of that as well, which have to be given primacy? Nobody would disagree with that. So I think there are important lessons to be learned from that. But just on the conduct of the referendum, and frankly, any misbehaviour on any side has got to be called out. And of course, individuals are responsible for their own actions. But I would have to say that in general, I think we should be proud of what happened in that referendum campaign. And I can think in particular about what happened with younger people, 16 and 17-year-olds voting for the first time. I can remember very clearly, in Skye at the time, we had a Yes shop in the main street in Portree and Wentworth Street. And the young people that would come in from Portree High School, regardless of what side they were on, wanting information, we actually did across Skye and Lochhouse, we did 55 public meetings over the period of the referendum. In fact, even one that was hosted by a no campaigner in the island of Razzie, which was one of the moments I'll never forget. And I think we should take pride in the fact that unlike the Brexit referendum, it was more about that debate as to what kind of country Scotland could be. So, yeah, look, if there's been bad behaviour, it should be called out. It's not appropriate. And, I'm sure we'll have an independence referendum again. I believe Scotland will become an independent country. But let's respect voices on all sides. And we ought to be able to debate those on the union side and those on the independent side. We've got to treat each other, we've got to treat the public with respect, because we owe it to them, and we owe it to them that we can improve, quite frankly, the standing of politicians in public life, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, Michael, I'm interested on that note, I suppose, talking about debate and having respectful debate on both sides. We saw the big personalities that have led the SNP to victory. I've seen a lot of electoral success, one of those being Nicola Sturgeon, one of those being Alex Salmond. It feels as though, particularly if you look up to Holyrood, there is less an appetite for constructive debate, but also less of a sort of personality cult up there. Do you think that the SNP, the nationalist movement, requires a personality cult to succeed?
Well, I think I agree with your analysis that there is definitely less of a personality cult. I mean, there was certainly a period of a few years, sort of 2015 onwards, where it was so much so the Nicola Sturgeon show. But I think actually I disagree with you that there's now an issue around closed up debate. I think there's opportunity for that to get better because it's less of a personality show. I mean, in the last few years, you've had backbench rebellions from the SNP in Holyrood, you've had ministerial resignations, you've had people changing parties. One of the reasons why Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, to my mind, I don't know what Ian thinks about this, but one of the reasons why they blew the other parties out of the water is because of this ruthless approach they had to party discipline. They created a party where there was, not questioning. And part of the problem for the SNP in recent years is that more people are, prepared to take pot shots. We could all name current or former, shall we say, older SNP members who do that all the time. And obviously, Alex Salmond ended up doing that in the latter years for obvious reasons. And I think that not being a personality cult anymore might potentially be a bad thing for the SNP, but I would argue it's a very good thing for Scotland.
Yeah, Ian, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. Do you think that this ruthless discipline can come back? Do you think it's good that it might have gone away, essentially? More people are able to speak up from the backbenches in the SNP?
The public will not forgive parties that are not united. I mean, that's self-evident. However, and having said that, one of the things that I certainly observed in Westminster, there were a number of senior backbenchers across the House that could be quite outspoken, but actually added to the debate in the House of Commons because they brought a lot of wisdom. And I think there's a way for people not necessarily always to be 100% on message, but able to be a voice for good, if I can put it that way. And I think that's important when it comes to legislation. And that's true whether it's in Westminster, whether it's in Holyrood, because we've got to make sure that our legislative processes are robust. We need to challenge the way that we legislate, and I'd say in both parliaments as well. So yes, of course, you need a certain amount of discipline. Yes, when parliamentarians are elected, they're elected on a manifesto, and they should be true to that manifesto. But we've got to find ways, all of us within that you encourage people to think in an appropriate manner and act in an appropriate manner, but not to be disrespectful to the party that has elected them. I think there's a way to do these things.
And you spoke actually earlier about Nicola and saying that she was in many ways peerless in the way that she communicated. And we've just spoken there about there maybe being less of a personality cult within the SNP at the moment. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about a possible leadership contest. I know we're speaking in hypotheticals here, but if you were to put John Swinney to the side for 1 second, is there anyone in your mind in the current Westminster or Holyrood group that you see as being the next leader of the SNP to lead the party towards independence?
So can I maybe put that in a slightly different way, really, because what we've really seen, what's happening now as we approach the next election, and what happened at the last Scottish parliamentary election, is that those that had led the SNP, not necessarily just the party leader, but those that have been senior figures within the cabinet, are effectively retiring. So I think what you're going to see over the course of the next few years is a new generation coming to the fore. And let's see how that develops. I'm not going to give any names to you about who I think might be the next leader, but there will be space for people to emerge and to show that they are ready to serve not just the party, but not but the government as well. And I hope the SNP is in government. I can't take that for granted post the election next year. But there are certainly people of talent that are standing for election, and I hope that they flourish.
I mean, sticking on the subject of Holyrood, Kate Forbes says that she will not stand at the next election for her constituency of Skye, Lochaber and Basingstoke. You know, that's an area that you've represented in the past for Westminster. Are you going to stand?
I didn't put myself forward for vetting to be an SNP candidate. It wasn't in my mind to stand for the Scottish Parliament. What I've done, Lucy, is I've sought to be respectful to those that have asked me from the constituency over the course of the last few days. It is something I was not minded to do. Having said that, you know, we've reflected on some of the things which are going on. I am deeply concerned about the economy. That when the UK cannot increase its debt level, the Chancellor will increase tax levels again in the budget this year. But we are not far away from a financial crisis. We know what the bond yield is in the UK compared to other places. How do we create the economic growth that will make a difference for all of us in these islands, and certainly for Scotland as well? I wrote a paper on Industrial Council just a couple of years ago with Sir Martin Donnelly and Dominic Holder, and I would like to find a way that I can still have an influence in that debate. And I don't believe that I have to be in the Scottish Parliament to do that, but I'll carefully reflect on what people have asked me to do, but my primary concern was not to get myself elected to Holyrood, if I can put it that way.
That sounds like you're running, Ian.
No, please don't, and I don't want to see anybody taking that from it. The people that have asked me to stand are people that I've campaigned with over many, many years, and I hold them in very high regard. But it was not in my thinking to stand in Holyrood. I will reflect on what people have said, but for preference, it is not what I was seeking to do.
That's not you ruling it out anyway at this point.
It would be a big push for me to get myself there, and I'm not there.
Fine. Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today, and really, really enjoyed that conversation. And thank you very much, Michael, too.